Morning everyone. I already uploaded part 1 of this sweet pea tutorial for you on YouTube. I will link it below, and this is the finished tutorial of the sweet pea that we painted. I use a tissue paper to lift out some of the highlights, and then I will just go over the whole section again with a water glaze. But this way I can create some beautiful highlights. I like to layer my watercolors with layers and layers of transparent and semi-transparent watercolors. Sometimes it will be an opaque watercolor that I use, but most of the time I like to use transparent watercolors or semi-transparent watercolors. That way I can build up all the layers, and I always make sure that after each layer that I paint, I wait for the layer to dry completely. That way I make sure I don't disturb each layer that I already painted on the petal or the flower that I've painted. I always started with the lightest washes, then I go in with darker washes and start adding in all of the darker detail that you can see on the flower. The darker detail is always with a thicker consistency of paint. So as you can see on the palette next to me, or the little plate next to me, my colors are quite thick now because I'm starting to add all of the details. So each layer is a little bit darker than all of the first washes that I paint on the beginning of this sweet pea flower. So what I'm doing now is I am just building up on all of the detail that I want to add on the sweet pea, on the petals that I can see all the little darker, little shadowy parts or the folds of the petals. And this is the fun part. And I like to use a brush with a nice tip for this one. Now I use a Da Vinci brush. This brush is very old. I've had it for a very long time. I've looked after it, and you will see in a lot of my tutorials that I use this brush very often. Just because it holds a lot of water, it has a nice tip. Every time I finish with it, I rinse the brush, and then I make sure that I roll it on a tissue paper. If you looked at some of my previous tutorials, I show you exactly how I store my brushes, and this is very important, especially if you pay a lot for sable hair brushes. And now the synthetic hair brushes will also work for this. Just make sure you have a brush with a nice tip. The next tutorial that I am painting for Patreon is for beginners. I didn't add too many little veins and too many details, so you will notice that I made it especially for my beginners on Patreon. And this one had a little bit more detail, but I do think that if you are a beginner in watercolors, you can still paint this. After all, how did you learn how to drive? You had to learn how to drive somehow, and sometimes you didn't just drive in the small little roads where it's easy to drive. You had to drive on the highway where it was a whole lot of cars coming past you. And that's what I always say to my students: you have to learn how to paint. And I would say jump in, get your brushes ready, and start painting not always the easiest paintings. That way you're going to just stay stagnant and you're never going to move forward. You're always going to want to paint the easiest painting because you always think you're a beginner. Sometimes you have to jump in and paint the more difficult flowers. And I know it might not turn out okay. Might not turn out okay the first time, but it will turn out one day perfect and you will be very happy. So that is the reason why I say don't always just paint beginner tutorials. There's nothing wrong with beginner tutorials, especially if you want to learn, if you are really a beginner. But I do have students that after many years still tell me they are beginners, and I know for a fact, because I can see their progress on their watercolors, they are no longer beginners, but yet they still paint the easiest paintings, and they are scared. They are scared to move forward. They are scared to jump in and paint the hardest or the most difficult flowers. These are not difficult. If you let me say it this way, if you take, for instance, one petal at a time, because sometimes that's what I do, especially when I paint a rose. Roses are quite difficult to paint, especially ones with a lot of detail. So what I do is I take each section as a, for instance, I will think it's a puzzle, and I will just paint each section. That way it's much easier for me to complete a rose, because it is difficult. It's sometimes, some roses, I will share a rose that I painted recently that had so much detail on, and shadows and folds, but the way I painted it was by painting each petal and each shadow and each part of the rose. And I think if you battle as a beginner, do it that way. Take each petal and paint each petal separately. That way you won't always want to paint the easiest flowers. I'm not saying that you only have to paint the most difficult flowers. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying sometimes you don't even have to share what you paint. Sometimes just jump in and try and paint a difficult intermediate to advanced watercolor tutorial, just to test your your skills. And always go back. So like I said before, in some of my tutorials and online school, I said to my students, keep a watercolor sketchbook, and go back and look at it in a year's time or 2 years time, and paint the same flower, sometimes twice, and then go back and a year apart, and then go back and check how you progressed, and how your skills changed, how much how much your watercolor technique changed. That's the way I always judge my skills, because I can see I also change the way I paint all the time. And that's the way you're gonna learn, I promise you. Even if you can't draw now, eventually you will. Eventually you will be able to draw, especially if you practice and you do it often. Okay, so again, as you can see, I'm darkening all of those little sections at the top of that petal, and the colors that I use are absolutely beautiful and vibrant. And like I said before, I try to use most of my transparent or semi-transparent watercolors from Mission Magello watercolors that I ordered from Amazon. They are beautiful colors, and I am so impressed with the colors. The next tutorial that I am planning on painting is this orchid, Phalaenopsis or moth orchid, and well, I'm going to use mostly Winsor & Newton watercolors, just because a lot of students have Winsor & Newton or Core watercolors, or Daniel Smith and Sennelier. It is such a pity that this Magello Mission watercolors are not very popular, because they are beautiful. So I can highly recommend them. I am not affiliated with them. I'm just telling you that they are absolutely beautiful, and if you can maybe buy a few tubes just to test out or try out, or maybe mix and match your colors, because I like to use all different brands of watercolors. I don't just stick with one brand. But if you can, for instance, just buy one tube of the Mission Magello watercolors, you will see what I mean. They are absolutely beautiful colors and so vibrant. So if I talk about transparent or semi-transparent watercolors, I will show you exactly what to look for, which is important if you one day start to paint in watercolors, because that is what I look at all the time. I never used to when I started painting in watercolor as a beginner, but for my style of watercolor paintings that I do, I like to use transparent or semi-transparent watercolors. And like I said, also I do sometimes jump in and use some opaque watercolors. That's fine too. So as you can see, I now painted most of this beautiful sweet pea, and I should actually share a little video. I wanted to paint one of the little sweet peas and I wanted to cut it open, but I discovered tiny little birds in my garden that got underneath the net and they stole my beautiful sweet peas. So we hardly had any left after I painted all of these because they stole the flowers, and then we didn't have any sweet peas. They're so cute. They had these tiny little hairdos on the top of their head. I might link it in the future on YouTube. I just want to find that video, but they are so cute. I might add it at the end of this video for you, if you want to see what they did to my garden through the kitchen window. My daughter grabbed my phone and just recorded it, and I was so shocked. Anyway, this is the watercolor sweet pea that we painted. I'm also going to share the link of the line drawing and all the colors that I use for this painting. If you want to paint along, you're welcome to. The full step-by-step tutorial will be on Patreon if you want to join us over there, and if you want to learn to paint in this style of watercolor. I hope to see you soon, and I will have a new tutorial for you.